So I'm excited to get started into today's discussion. As you know, we get pretty excited about Toronto's budget process at Social Planning Toronto. We see the budget process and the budget as a key indicator of the values and priorities of City Council. And as the saying goes, it's a chance to see if Council is prepared to put their money where their mouth is. Ultimately, it's the impact of those budget decisions and the people it affects that we are most concerned about. We have two upcoming budget workshops. Sorry, I'll just share these with you that are going to help residents, individuals, your colleagues that you can share this with, who will want to dive a little bit deeper into understanding tax myths and facts and what is the story behind how a city budget is put together. So it's for people who may have an interest in the budget but want to learn a little bit more. Our first workshop is coming up on November 14th at 6:30 to 8 p.m. It's going to be virtual, and we have speakers from Toronto Acorn as well as the Migrant Rights Alliance. So please, it's going to be a great discussion, and join us there. We're going to dive deep and engage in discussion about what do we need to see out of our budget? What do we need to see? Who does it serve, and how are people affected by it? Our next workshop, and then we have a workshop coming up on November 28th from 6:30 to 8, where we'll give more highlights into how our city budget is determined. How do we balance things like capital versus operating costs, as well as what's really important to low-income communities in Toronto. So the links for those will be shared in the chat. So please go ahead, share them with your friends and colleagues, and do please register. So as you know, we had a by-election and ended up with a new mayor earlier this year. Many of us were excited when we elected a new mayor that campaigned specifically on creating a more open and transparent budget process. For those of us who've been advocating for more than a decade of austerity budgets, it was a refreshing change. But of course, we had questions about what this year's budget process would look like. So to kick off this year's budget process, you may have heard the announcement. The mayor and budget chief have launched a citywide budget consultation process that's going to take place throughout the month of November. If you subscribe to the city's SPT's Budget Watch blog, you would have received a list of the consultation dates and locations, as well as links to the city's website where you can complete an online survey. If you don't already subscribe to the blog, please do. It has great information and breakdowns of the city budget, thanks to our resident expert, Beth Wilson. So a link will be shared in the chat where you can find the city budget consultation dates, as well as how to sign up for SPT's Budget Watch blog. We are encouraging everyone to participate in this consultation process by either attending one of the in-person or virtual consultations, or by sharing your input online. We also recognize, however, that our voices have not always been listened to through many past city consultations, whether they be for the budget or other such strategies or policies. And so we don't necessarily know that this is going to be any different. What we do know is that the city is facing one of the most dismal budgets in its recent history. And if cuts are on the horizon, we do need to make sure that the mayor and city council hear loud and clear that this is not something our communities can bear. So the consultation processes are going to be taking place throughout the month of November. What we know so far is that this will help to inform the city's budget launch, which will take place on January 10th. The budget review will take place by the budget committee on January 16th to 18th. And then deputations and public hearings of the budget will happen January 22nd to 23rd in different locations across the city. The budget committee will then do a wrap up on January 26th. And then it will, in between that time, the mayor will present her budget, and then it will be debated at the February 14th City Council meeting. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And now I can see your faces, which is nice. So I just want to give you a little background of how we decided to plan today's event. Back in early October, our informal budget coalition, of which many of you are a part of, we met to begin talking about the upcoming city budget process. So that in early on, and it was felt like it was really early on in the budget process, but we still had over 50 people come out to talk to us and share their impressions and learn. Our resident budget expert, Beth Wilson, gave us an overview of the recently approved long-term financial plan that was approved by City Council early in September. A big part of this plan is the development of new revenue tools, which come in the form of new or enhanced taxes and fees. And so we decided to host today's discussion to help us gain a better understanding of different revenue tool options. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, DT Cochran, was unable to attend due to an illness. And so if there are questions that we're unable to cover in today's discussion that he might have addressed in his presentation on regressive and progressive taxation, we'll look to have him join us for a future conversation. To start us off, Beth Wilson is going to help us set the context for today's discussion. Many of you already know Beth Wilson, but for those of you who don't, Beth Wilson is a senior researcher at Social Planning Toronto and has been with the organization for over 20 years. She is our resident city budget expert, having tracked the city's budget process since 2002. She's the author of our Budget Watch blogs and the absolute best resource on understanding the social impacts of Toronto's budget. Beth, please go ahead and share your screen.
Thanks, Melissa, and thanks everyone for attending today. I'm going to get my presentation up. Okay, there we go. So I'm going to start us off with a few words about revenue tools, about revenues and taxes to set the context for today's discussion. And I want to start with saying how important municipal revenues are, how much they matter, and why we're talking about revenue tools. The City of Toronto is central in terms of the delivery of a vast number of programs and services. Some of those are cost shared with provincial and federal governments. Some of them are delivered by nonprofit organizations, including folks who are in the meeting today. And we know that those services are essential to the quality of life of Toronto residents, and municipal revenues help support that work in the community. And so if we want a city that delivers in terms of social equity, climate action goals, it really needs to be resourced one way or another to do the job. And that's part of the discussion today, is in what way should the city be resourced? Unfortunately, and I think many of you have been, like us, very frustrated with this situation. The city has had a long-standing revenue problem. It has been made worse by the pandemic and the impact of inflation. And for many years, the mayors of the day and a majority on council and also senior orders of government have either denied, minimized, ignored, avoided the problem, kicked the can down the road for another day. And we can see and we can experience what that means in our communities today in terms of crumbling infrastructure, inadequate services, deep inequity, and many communities in crisis in our city. So this fall, the Toronto City Council adopted its long-term financial plan, and part of that is a goal to create a financially sustainable, appropriately resourced city. There are many details in that plan. One essential part of it is looking at new revenue tools, and a new deal for Toronto, could be a new deal for cities with the provincial and federal government. So in particular, the Toronto City Council requested revenue tools that would grow with the economy. And specifically, they have asked for powers to implement a municipal sales tax and or receive a portion of the revenue from the existing sales tax. So that's part of the backdrop of today's conversation about revenue tools. It really raises questions, important questions about how cities like ours should be funded, but also how can that be done in equitable ways? How can we ensure that our funding sources don't contribute to greater inequality in our city? I'm going to say a few words about progressive and regressive taxes, and some of this comes from really fantastic work that was done by CUPE and some researchers working with CUPE about 10 years ago, and it is as relevant today in many respects. So they looked at how can you progressively fund municipalities to do what they need to do. And they considered progressive taxes as taxes that rely on those most able to pay. So on the basis of income, and an example of that is progressive income taxes, where there is a higher tax rate for higher income earners, and there is a lower tax rate for lower income earners. And on the continuum of progressivity, regressivity in terms of taxes, the other end is regressive taxes, where lower and middle income households spend a higher share of their income than high income households do. And some examples are property taxes and sales taxes. However, there are many jurisdictions that have taken regressive taxes or regressive fees and taken some measures to try to make them less regressive, more fair. So in terms of the use of income-based exemptions, rebates, and credits to reduce the impact on individuals with lower incomes. So some examples, so in Toronto, there is a program where individuals, seniors with low income and people with disabilities with low income can apply to have their property tax increase canceled or to defer payment on it. So one way trying to address the regressivity of property taxes. The City of Toronto has fees for some of its recreation programs, and one of the ways it tries to address the regressivity and accessibility around recreation is through the welcome policy for low-income residents who can access programs through recreation subsidy. New York City has a municipal sales tax, and they have an exemption on the purchase of footwear and clothing that's under $110. So that's one way in which they try to make that local sales tax less regressive. And this is from the CUPE research from about 10 years ago. At that time, some of the European and Scandinavian countries, as well as Singapore, had progressive property taxes, where the tax rate, the property tax rate, was based on the value of the property. So more expensive homes, higher property tax rate, more modest homes in terms of the value of the home, a lower property tax rate. And so that was another way of trying to address that regressivity in property taxes. The City of Toronto, I'll just note, doesn't have the power to bring in progressive property taxes at this time. So if it considered something like that, it would need to get those powers through the province. And lastly, I will mention another view on progressivity, which is how the revenues from taxes are used. So if they are used to support social, environmental, and equity goals, they're used in a progressive way. So another, angle in terms of considering the regressivity of taxes and fees. And I will leave it there, and I'm really looking forward to David's presentation.
Thank you so much, Beth. I think that really lays the groundwork for David to speak next. So David Macdonald is a senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. David joined the CCPA as its senior Ottawa economist in 2011, after being a longtime contributor as a research associate. Since 2008, he has coordinated the alternate federal budget, which takes a fresh look at the federal budget from a progressive perspective. David has also written on a variety of topics, from childcare to income inequality to federal fiscal policy. He's a regular media commentator on national policy issues, often speaking to the CBC, Globe and Mail, Toronto Star, and Canadian Press. Thank you, David, for joining us for this discussion today.
Great. Well, thanks so much, folks, for the invitation. I'm going to be focusing specifically on municipal income taxes. And there's a bit of background to this. It actually comes from a meeting that the Federation of Canadian Municipalities organized in Ottawa a month or two ago. FCM is very interested in new revenue options for cities broadly, not just for Toronto, but cities generally, for the same reasons as you folks are interested in increases in revenues. Cities are creatures of the province. They have very limited taxation powers. And as a result, despite downloading of costs in a variety of forms, they find they don't have enough money to cover those costs coming from federal and provincial transfers. So FCM is interested in a new framework, is what they're calling it, for revenue options for the cities. It was an interesting conference. What was particularly interesting from my perspective was I was at a table with Mayor Olivia Chow. And here in this option of the several that I presented off the cuff was the one she was most interested in. And so I'm not sure how telling that is in terms of how likely it is to be adopted, although this is very dependent on other levels of government. But I've developed it further so that we've got, a bit more of a take on this and specified it for the City of Toronto, just so you can see how it might work. I should say that often the way that revenue options for cities or simply more resources for cities are framed is either getting more money from the federal and provincial governments for something, for a particular purpose, providing childcare or something like that. It's framed like that. Or it's framed as a broad-based federal or provincial tax increase that is then transferred to the cities, say on a per capita basis. This could be a point of the GST. It could be, 1% of personal income taxes, some proportion of an existing tax that is raised by another level of government and then transferred to the cities. I think that there's actually a missing option here. I think the missing option is to provide more choices for individual cities to access existing federal and provincial systems, but have it be municipal choice, not provincial or federal choice, and not have it be across the country or not have it be across the entire province, but have it be specific to cities. I think this is an underappreciated and underutilized choice. And I think that given the technology that exists today, it's possible to provide cities with specific tools where they can access particularly the income tax system, whether it be federal or provincial. I'd advocate for federal, but in any event. And so I want to go through some of those options with you today. So this is kind of a quick overview of the broad tax systems that are available to other levels of government, but are not available to cities and not available to the City of Toronto. So the broad ones are personal income taxes. This is something that you would pay on your personal income tax form. You compile your T4s and you pay for that in March. There are business or corporate income taxes. This is levied against business income or profits declared by businesses. There are, of course, sales taxes like the GST, HST, which is under discussion at the City of Toronto. There's also, interestingly, a discussion of payroll deductions. So this would be, I suppose, like personal income taxes, but the idea would be that, everybody who works for a business in the City of Toronto pays an additional 1% of whatever they're paid to the City of Toronto. This is similar, I suppose, in a sense to personal income taxes. I've seen it in a variety of position papers on this topic, but without the brackets. So everybody kind of pays a flat fee. It's kind of like a flat tax. One of the arguments for a payroll deduction, just like, for instance, you get a payroll deduction for CPP or EI, is that the people that use transportation networks to get into the city, you can think of the City of Toronto, right? Paying for all these roads as people commute in from the suburbs, they take GO, they commute on the highways, whatever, that the payroll tax would better capture the costs incurred by the city versus personal income taxes, which tax you where you live versus where you commute to. So, I guess there's a plausible argument there. I'm not sure I'm particularly in favor of payroll deductions in general, but anyway, it's discussed. I put it on the list. So one of the benefits of all of these tax systems is that they grow organically with GDP or the size of the economy. Why is that important? Well, it's important certainly because of inflation, which we've seen over the past year in great strides. We used to be, you could just put 2% in the equation and that's sort of inflation every year forever. That wasn't the case over the last 2 years. As you all know, I'm sure municipal property taxes do not grow with inflation. In fact, they don't grow at all, except if you build more buildings. This can be infill, it can be sprawl. Either way, that's the only real way to increase the property tax bill from the, that goes to the city, except by, quote unquote, raising taxes. Now, what's interesting about, which is to say you're changing the actual mill rate, you're changing the tax rate that you multiply your property value by. And so you'll see this in discussions of this, city budgets is, we want to keep the tax increase to 3%, quote unquote, and not 6% or something like that. The federal and provincial governments don't do this at all, right? They never increase taxes in the sense that they never change the tax rate per se. The revenue from taxes just goes up. It goes up not only in line with inflation, but roughly in line with increased population growth as well. That's sort of a rough proxy for long-term economic growth. And so provincial and federal governments never deal with this issue. You'll notice this, right? The provincial government doesn't say, we're going to increase taxes by 2% or 3% this year to cover inflation. They don't say that because they rely on these systems that largely change with the rate of economic growth. And this is one of their big benefits, is you really get away from this sort of fight every year about, is the tax increase going to be 3% or 4%? That just goes away. And what's interesting is that over this inflationary period, revenues have boomed at the federal and provincial level, eliminating deficits across the board at the provincial level and reducing them certainly at the federal level. So this is why you want your revenues to grow organically. City revenues don't grow organically, and it's a real problem. I should say that that particularly business and corporate income taxes, certainly they do grow organically with GDP, but there's a real double-edged sword here that in recessions, they plummet. That's not the case for personal income taxes and sales taxes. They might grow more slowly, but corporate income taxes can legitimately go down, which is potentially why you wouldn't want to rely on them as much. Some of the other consideration for using these revenue sources at the city level is whether you could piggyback on existing federal or provincial programs. If you have to create your own systems, that's more complicated. It's more prone to abuse and avoidance. And so certainly when it comes to personal income taxes, cities, the provinces and the federal government already collect personal income taxes. And so you would just sort of tack something onto those existing systems, piggyback on those systems. For business and corporate taxes, certainly other levels of government do collect corporate income taxes. But the allocation isn't down to the city level, it's down to the provincial level. And so it would actually be relatively difficult to create a system where businesses pay corporate income tax to the city. There's a lot of room here that we'll talk about here for tax avoidance on this front. So I would be very nervous about this as a potential long-term revenue source for cities. Certainly sales taxes already exist. The businesses are located in a particular location. You could just say, look, the HST is 1% higher if you live in this postal code or in these sets of postal codes that define the city of Toronto, for instance. The same thing's true for personal income taxes. CRA knows where you live. You have to tell CRA where you live in order to file personal income taxes, and they could use that as a proxy for whether you live in the city of Toronto or any particular city for that matter. When it comes to payroll deductions, I mean, certainly the federal government manages CPP and EI contributions. And so employers deduct these and send them off to the feds, and the feds then put them into a fund. There's an EI fund, there's a CPP fund. Those are dedicated separate funds. These are often called payroll taxes, presuming that they go nowhere. It's just for general revenue, but that's completely false. Of course, CPP and EI contributions go into dedicated funds for particular things, insurance against unemployment, insurance when you retire, and so on. And so these systems don't really exist. I mean, I suppose you could create them in a sense to piggyback on federal collection of CPP and EI. But again, this is a bit of a stretch. The other piece that's worth considering is how easy is it to avoid these taxes? When it comes to personal income taxes, there is a big barrier to avoiding them. You have to move. That's not a small barrier. It's substantial, and just because you move doesn't necessarily mean you're better off, because, maybe you see lower services as a result of not paying, higher income taxes. So there is a high barrier there. It is relatively hard to avoid that. For business and corporate income taxes, this would be relatively easy to avoid. Certainly large corporations are very adept at avoiding business taxes. And particularly if you didn't have the tools of the CRA, within the Canadian context, it's tough to avoid taxes if the company made money in the country, or if they're employing people in the country. There's a formula you can use. And so you can't just shift all your business revenue to Iqaluit and just pay a lower tax rate. That's not actually how it works. But this isn't done municipally. It'd be relatively hard to cut out tax avoidance. Sales tax, you just drive another 4 minutes down the 401 and avoid it, right? Drive it to the city of Toronto, drive to Markham, right? Buy that same thing you're going to buy at Walmart, but buy it in Markham. This is relatively easy to avoid, unfortunately. Of course, sort of bad traffic conditions in Toronto might make it actually relatively hard for you to just maybe you got to drive a half an hour outside of the city to pay lower sales taxes. But this is relatively it's relatively easy to avoid. And payroll deductions, again, you would have to quit your job and move to a different job in order to avoid these. And so that is a pretty high bar. Not to say people might not do it, but it is a relatively high bar. So those are some sort of rough, pieces. We've talked. There was some discussion about progressivity. Personal income tax is certainly more progressive than sales taxes. So, I mean, this is traditionally how municipal income taxes are framed. This is projected total federal income taxes payable from everybody living in the GTA, not Toronto, but the GTA. They will pay $40 billion in only 1 year in 2024. So this is like a lot of money paid by people in the GTA to the federal government. They paid $23 billion to the provincial government. Now, if you sort of said, well, we would take 1% of that and provide that to the city of Toronto or every city in the province, and adjust it to the population in the city of Toronto, that'd be worth just under 200 million for the city of Toronto if the feds were to do it, 100 million if the province was to do it. You see the province collects a bit less. Because the population size in Toronto is slightly less, a little bit under half of what you would find in the entire GTA. This is traditionally how this is pitched. I think we should go further than this. I think there's a real opportunity to push for something quite different here. And the different approach here is to provide the city or cities, city of Toronto or any city for that matter, with access to the tax system. So the province and the federal government wouldn't raise personal income taxes or raise sales taxes specifically, but provide the cities with access to existing provincial income tax systems with some flexibility. So provide them access to the basic tax table, such that they could change that tax table and reap the rewards. This is, I think, fundamentally different because it's the city changing tax rates. It's not the province. It's not a tax increase from the province. It's the city raising taxes. And so I think with, traditionally, the reason why I think you would go with sort of a 1% increase is that was what was possible given the technology 20 years ago. Like, how easy is it to like identify particular people by postal code and charge a different tax rate for them? I mean, 20 years ago, that might have been challenging in terms of software at the CRA or how people file taxes, usually on paper. No one files taxes on paper anymore. I mean, everybody uses a tax program. All this stuff is done electronically now. It would be much easier to implement something like this down to the city level. And so what this provides, I think, for cities, or could provide, is, you're not asking for a tax increase. You're asking for access to the tax system, to which you can do a variety of very interesting things now that you couldn't do before. One of them is do nothing, right? Cities don't have to use this facility. It's a facility potentially for cities to use, but they don't have to use it. The second one, of course, is obviously, to swap revenue. So decrease property taxes, say, but increase income taxes. So there's no net benefit to the city. I mean, this is a possibility. But the benefit over time is that if you're relying on personal income taxes, those actually grow automatically year after year, whereas the property tax base does not. Or you could just straight up increase revenues. I mean, that's another option. Certainly, I think folks on this call might be more interested in that third option. But this provides it's a very different approach, frankly, to personal income taxes than just like, why doesn't the province charge an extra 1% and give it to us? This is cities actively choosing it, and also potentially eating the perceived consequences. So the province and the federal government can wash their hands of it and say, we didn't increase taxes. The city increased taxes, and hopefully they're going to do something useful with it. Provide better services, close the budget deficit, whatever. So this is the Ontario Basic Personal Income Tax Table. This is progressive income taxes. So, up to $50,000 in taxable income, you pay a tax rate of 5.5%. For every dollar above $50,000, you pay 9.15% against every dollar between 50 and 100,000, and so on and so forth. You've got these 5 brackets here. And so this is the value of raising this rate by 1% in the city of Toronto exclusively, and then sending that money to the city of Toronto in 2024. It's $413 million if you were to change this rate from 9.15 to 10.15. About 1 million people in the city of Toronto would pay more. There's about 3 million people in the city of Toronto proper. Only 1 million would pay more for a variety of reasons. And the average amount more that they would pay would be about $400 a year. Now, here's where it gets interesting, right? Is access to this basic tax table allows you to target these increases, if you wanted to higher brackets. So you could restrict tax increases, say, to only those making over $220,000. And if you change this from 13.16 to 14.16, 45,000 people in the city of Toronto would be affected. That's pretty limited. And they would pay an extra $200 million in taxes. On average, their taxes would go up about $4,000. I actually think that the federal government is a better vehicle for this, insofar as, you're looking at FCM, it's Canada-wide, it's not just specific to the city of Toronto, it's not just specific to Ontario. And so here are the exact same calculations: number of people affected in the city of Toronto, the value of the taxes raised for every point changed in the tax rate, and the average amount that people affected would pay, in this case, $318 a year, if you change this from 20.5, where it stands presently, to 21.5. Now, one of the objections to municipal income taxes is actually an objection to any municipal taxation of any kind, which is people will just move. People will move and they'll avoid this income tax. But of course, because the rates are different, they'll move. But of course, the tax rates are already different between cities in the GTA. Here is a list of GTHA cities in 2022. These are the municipal property tax rates. And there's nothing new here. I mean, if people were actually moving due to tax rates, they'd flood Toronto because Toronto's tax rates are half of what the tax rates are in places like Hamilton or Ajax. And this is quite a widespread. It's not as if they're all sort of coming together at around the same municipal tax rate. They're actually quite different. And so this is plausibly where people might want to move to, if they thought the tax rates are different. And maybe, if they're an accountant and they're an economist, and this is all they're concerned about is municipal tax rates, and they want to decrease their municipal tax. They don't care about services. They don't care about commuting 3 hours to their job. They can already do that, right? There's nothing stopping them from doing that. Now, of course, the other piece to this is that folks often say, well, house prices adjust for property taxes. I'm not sure how true that is, but in any event, here's the adjustment, including, the value of homes. So this is the average tax bill in each one of these cities based on the average value of houses, but also the tax rate. And you can see that there's a huge difference between what people pay in the GTHA. There's a $4,000 a year difference between what people pay on average in Toronto in property taxes and what they pay on average in places like Oakville, Ajax, Pickering, Aurora. If people were really that concerned, they would move out of Oakville and move to Toronto. That's all they cared about, was reducing their municipal taxes. I'm not sure that's happening, but in any event, all of these issues are already in play. And so if you have a municipal tax that's part of the mix, I'm not sure anyone but accountants and economists would ever be able to figure it out. But in any event, the way that you would move, though, is not obvious. So, let's imagine a scenario where Toronto institutes a new municipal income tax on people making over $220,000, and Oakville doesn't. Right? People will say, well, that's nonsense. I'm going to move out of Toronto. I'm going to move to Oakville. It's nicer anyway, and I like the view of the water. But of course, even on that basic premise, it's still maybe not cheaper. I mean, here is, the city of Toronto average taxes, this property taxes, plus the amount that you would pay if you, on average, were making over $220,000. It's actually still cheaper than going to Oakville, where hypothetically there isn't such a tax. So these calculations don't necessarily, I mean, people always threaten to move, but there is actually a lot more to life than taxes, services, where you work, where your kids go to school, where your spouse works. These are often dramatically more important and utterly overwhelm whatever tax changes you might have. But in any event, I think that these sort of standard arguments, well, people will just move, doesn't, first of all, they probably won't. But second of all, it's not even obvious where they would move to. In this case, they would, in this scenario, they should actually move to Toronto from Oakville, as opposed to the other way around. If you were doing the calculations properly, people that just generally aren't going to do that in any event. So what would be required for this to happen? CRA would have to make it possible. So there's real adjustments that CRA would have to do to properly collect this, and liaise with provinces, with cities, and cities would have to sign up. Do we need provincial sign-on for this? Probably, because to avoid retaliation, but legally, I'm not entirely clear that we would. I think that the federal government could probably do this alone. They already sign agreements directly with cities and have been for the latest, what's it called now? The municipal fund to change zoning. They're sending money to cities to change zoning laws. I mean, this came out of the federal budget 3 years ago. They're perfectly capable of signing deals with the cities, providing them with differential amounts of money. On the other hand, through the carbon tax in particular, they charge different provinces different amounts. And so they, I think, likely could charge people in cities different amounts if they wanted to, and then make agreements with those cities to transfer the money. Now, the big loophole here, and why you probably would need provincial agreement to provide the facility, of course, there's not a tax increase here. This is just providing access to cities who want to use it, but they don't have to, is that in Quebec, the Quebec government has actually made it illegal for cities to sign agreements with the federal government. And so no Quebec cities can sign an agreement with the federal government to gain access to the Housing Accelerator Fund, which is this fund that provides money to cities to make zoning more liberal. They can't do it, so it's illegal. So Quebec actually cannot access that. Quebec cities cannot access that funding at all. It's illegal for them. You could certainly imagine a situation where if the federal government didn't have provincial sign-on, maybe the Ford government would simply change the rules, copy the Quebec legislation, and make it illegal, kiboshing the project. And so this is certainly a longer-term project, but it's I think a different prospect than just increasing taxes and sending the money to the province, increasing taxes and sending the money to the cities. I should say that Quebec, for instance, has raised its sales tax and provided a portion of that sales tax to the cities on a per capita basis. So maybe I'm wrong there. In any event, I think that tools, not tax increases, is potentially a way to crack that nut, to get into the tax systems that do increase with GDP. I think the federal government should be the primary initial target. I don't think the provinces are necessary, or all the provinces anyway, are necessarily going to sign on to this as an option. But there's a long game here, right? You only have to have them sign on once to get it to be part of the system. Maybe this provincial government wouldn't sign on. Maybe they would, but maybe future governments might. But having the facility in place and the commitment federally for it to happen, I think makes that, more likely and more possible. So I'm a bit over time there, but thanks so much for your attention, and look forward to any questions you might have.
David, thank you so much. This is a very exciting proposition to hear about. And what I'm curious about is, what's been the response so far? What has been the response from municipalities, and what has been the response at the federal level?
Well, you guys are getting a sneak peek. I mean, I haven't written this up. It's not an official CCPA document of any kind. I'm just sort of pitching ideas here. I talked it over with Randy, my colleague in the Ontario office, which who is much more connected to this network than I am. And he said, "Yeah, why don't you just pitch it to the Social Planning Council in Toronto?" I said, "Okay, great." So here you folks are. This is kind of the initial pitch. I should say that Mayor Chow was very interested in this idea when I pitched it to her personally a couple months ago. Again, this is a long-term prospect. It's not going to save, the City of Toronto budget for this year because it would require federal changes. But you could imagine the federal government potentially committing to making the changes, and then 2 years from now offering it as an option for provinces to sign on. And all they have to do is agree. Like the provinces, all they have to do is agree in principle to this, so that there isn't retaliation, a Quebec-style prohibition on federal transfers direct to the provinces. But once the technical pieces are in place, I don't think it'd be that hard. So yeah, what is going to be? I mean, I think for the cities, my pitch would actually be that FCM adopt this approach, the tools not taxes approach, in general to their revenue. The revenue framework, because they're pitching to the federal government more than the provincial governments. I don't know if they'll go for it, but it's an option. And will the provinces sign on? I think that in general, provinces that don't like taxation would just not sign on principle, that they don't believe there should be any taxation, additional taxation options, access to taxation options, tax swaps, any tax changes whatsoever available to the cities. That's my suspicion. I don't know if it's true, but I think that is my suspicion, that this would be seen as a tax increase, even though it isn't, right? It provides options to cities. They could decrease taxes, frankly. You could decrease property taxes, swap it over to the income tax side, and maybe you're no better off. I mean, that's certainly an option. You could do nothing. But I think like this would rile up the backs of anti-tax folks who don't want to see anybody pay taxes, right? They just don't want, they want no taxes, no services, right? Leave me to my sort of libertarian bungalow in whatever the city, and magically have all city services and roads and transit appear before me without me paying any taxes.
That's well, it's hopefully that there's some interest in this. I'm curious to know, what do you see as some resistance that might happen at the provincial level? And one of the questions in the chat from Doug is, if a province signed on, could another government come in and undo that?
I mean, that's always the case, right? Governments can always go back on policy. I think once you've got an agreement signed between the federal and provincial governments and you've got cities using it, that becomes harder. So yes, you can always back out and you can trash programs. Once they're being used, it becomes much harder. So, I mean, the same thing could be said, for the federal child care plan, for instance. You got all this new federal money flowing to the provinces to provide cheaper child care. People say, well, the feds could just cancel it, right? You just get a new government and they just cancel it outright, keep the money and spend it on tax cuts or something like that. Well, that is possible. I mean, these agreements between the federal and provincial governments always have exit clauses, and the timeframes are relatively short. A year, you sign up, you say we're getting out of this, and a year later you're out. But the trouble, of course, is that once people start relying on them and using them, it becomes harder to do that. And so with the change, with any big changes like this, the first couple of years are extremely fragile. But once they become part of the system and they're used, and then you potentially have maybe you've got more conservative mayors that like this system better than property taxes. And so maybe they push back internally at other levels of government. So yeah, it would certainly be fragile for the first couple of years. That's true, but that's true for cities are well aware of how fragile revenue sources can be when the province just steps in and cancels important sources of revenue and says, there you go, cities, make up the difference. You can't collect this anymore, right? And so, that can always put cities in a bind. If you're engaging other levels of government, I think it does actually become harder. But yeah, it can be fragile for sure.
Thanks, David. Yeah, new taxes are always a frightening thing, I think, for governments. I just wanted to open it up, let anyone know, if you want to ask a question, you can either pop it in the chat or you can use your raise hand function. We have a couple questions that have already come through the chat, so I'll just start going through those. So we have one question from John Stapleton. He's asking, we have special, sometimes hidden taxes on entertainment and hotel stays. How would these figure into one of the scenarios you cover? Would you keep them? Would you adjust other taxes like property taxes depending on which tools are used?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, John, is that there are other, I put some kind of quick tax types at the outset. There are clearly others, hotel tax, entertainment taxes, those sorts of things that municipalities often consider. I mean, I think that if you gained access to some of these other, well, particularly income taxes, but even sales taxes, like I think if you gained access to some of these bigger systems, there'd be a lot less interest in like a tax on hotels to fund tourism services. I think the reason why there's consideration of taxes on hotels to fund tourism services is because you don't have access to broader tax systems. And so you do what you can. And if you can get the hotels to sort of broadly sign on voluntarily, that's maybe better because you don't have to involve other levels of government. I mean, clearly involving other levels of government creates risks that you don't have if you're doing it on a smaller scale. But I think, if we're talking about really changing the game on revenue options for the cities, gaining access to these other big systems that the other levels that, the province of Ontario isn't trying to get a hotel surtax to fund tourism, right? That's not what the province of Ontario does because they don't have to, right? They have access to these better tax systems. let's give the cities access to them as well. And hopefully the cities wouldn't deal with kind of more middling taxes. In the short term, without federal and provincial agreement, those are the types of things you've got to consider and you'd use. I mean, the other thing too is I wouldn't be prescriptive. I think like an important position here is not to be prescriptive, not to say cities should, add 1 point to the top bracket federal taxes in order to eliminate their hotel tax or whatever. Let's not say that. Let's leave it up to cities to decide, right? Like let's have cities decide different things if they want to, right? That the goal here isn't tax increases or decreases or tax sameness. It's better tools. It's better tools that cities can use if they choose, but it's their choice. I mean, part of this is just due to the paternal approach to cities, that cities are incapable of making these decisions on their own. That Mayor Chow, who manages a city that is, 10% of the entire Canadian population, is incapable of figuring out that there's an impact to raising the top bracket in Toronto. That she cannot figure that out, and nobody else can figure it out, because cities would just foolishly raise income taxes to the roof because they don't know any better. That just doesn't square with me. It doesn't make any sense. But that's often the approach that you hear. We shouldn't give these tools to cities because they'll abuse them, quote unquote, right? As if a city of 3 million people has no understanding of how taxes or what potential implications are. I don't think that people are going to move from Toronto to Oakville or back because tax rates are different. They already are different. People can move. That's often an argument to say we shouldn't give them the tools because they might make that mistake because they can't figure it out. I don't think that's true. And it's a very paternalistic approach to cities that, 200 years ago might have been in that situation. Certainly aren't now. I mean, they're very sophisticated levels of government. They're perfectly capable of making these trade-offs.
Thanks, David. Hopefully others would see it that way. A question from Sarah Buchanan.
That would be my argument. I don't know that people would see it that way.
So related to that, would there be a risk that voters would perceive this income tax as a federal increase, which could make the feds not want to politically risk it? So, and how could that be avoided?
Yeah, I mean, this is the benefit of this approach. Instead of let's get 1% of whatever income taxes, we're going to increase taxes federally by 1%. We're going to give every city, whatever per capita amount or something like that. I did that calculation in the slideshow, and that's traditionally how this is approached. I think the difference of providing access is, I think that is fundamentally a different approach, and it becomes much more plausible for provincial or federal authorities to say, no, we didn't increase taxes. This is the city doing it. They're using our facilities, but this is straight up city money. They chose it. They're the ones gaining from it. I think that becomes much more plausible. Now, are people going to buy that? I don't know, but I think it's more plausible with city-specific decisions than it is if the province or the feds just increases the sales tax by 1% or whatever.
Okay. There's a question. Former Councillor Janet Davis is with us today. She's asking, are there constitutional impediments? John Stapleton doesn't think there is, but have you looked into it?
I don't think there are either. So first of all, the federal government is signing individual agreements right now with individual cities outside of Quebec for the Housing Accelerator Funds. This is a $4 billion fund created 2 federal budgets ago. And if cities, the criteria are relatively broad, but if cities kind of agree to accelerate zoning changes or speed up approval of housing permits, they get money. Those agreements are signed. So there's no restriction for the federal government to transfer money to cities at kind of its own choice on its own criteria. Nothing stopping it from doing that side of the transfer side. The other side is, could they change income taxes in a particular area so that those income taxes are higher in the city of Toronto, but remain at the same rate in the city of Oakville, for instance? Is that constitutionally legal? That I think is a bit potentially more difficult, but the federal government at present, via the carbon tax, does charge differential rates, depending on what province you're in and whether you've signed up for the, the federal, whether your province implements its own carbon tax, or whether you don't. If you don't, then the feds come in and do it. There's some debate as to whether that's appropriate, but that, it went to the Supreme Court and the feds won. So the feds can apply differential rates across the country. Can they do it at the city level? I'm not sure that has particularly been evaluated, but I'm not sure there's anything constitutionally wrong with it. The more specific issue, I think, is retaliation from the provinces. So if you cut the provinces out, they could just pull a Quebec. And they could say, yep, sure, maybe you have the constitutional right to charge differential income taxes, but you're not allowed to transfer it to the provinces directly without going through us, and we would just keep the money. That's what happens in Quebec, right? So in Quebec, cities are barred explicitly, because they are creations of the province, from signing agreements with the federal government, and so they cannot individually participate in the Housing Accelerator Fund. This is the sort of like, if you approve stuff more quickly, you get federal money. They can't apply to it. And so you could imagine Ontario retaliating and just removing that power from the provinces to receive money. So I think as a result of that, you're probably best to get provincial approval. But I don't think, technically, and I could be wrong on this, but I've investigated it slightly. I don't think there is actually constitutional restriction to the two sides charging differential rates and then transferring it. The one side's charging differential rates, and the second one is sending differential amounts to the cities, but the provinces could retaliate.
Okay, I'm going to shift gears a little bit into kind of very Ontario specific. A question from Liz is, what influence does Ontario's MPAC not reassessing CVAs, so current home value assessments, since 2016 have on the Toronto CVA-based taxes? So I don't know if you're able to answer that, or Beth, if you have an idea about this.
Yeah, it would change the distribution, but not the amount that the City of Toronto gets. This is the trouble, is that the mill rate adjusts for changes in valuation of property valuations. And so from a revenue perspective, City of Toronto would see no difference whatsoever in revenue. Like that's the issue with the mill rate, is it adjusts automatically for changes in property values. Now, it would change the distribution of who pays that, right? So houses now that, used to be valued at 500,000 when it was all locked in, and are now valued at 1.5 million. Well, this is not immediately obvious either. They may pay more tax, but sort of the average amount that, the average assessed amount would go up substantially. So if your assessed amount, like on, say we redid it this year, if your assessed amount went up more than the average assessed amount went up, then you would pay more. But it's not obvious. Just because the value of your house went up doesn't mean you would necessarily pay more taxes. So it's very specific to individual houses. You could calculate it at the neighborhood level, probably, as to who would pay more and who would pay less. But just, insofar as you're just concerned about revenue options, there's no difference. There'd be no change. This is the crazy thing. And so this is in contrast to provincial and federal income taxes, is that as people's income goes up, quote unquote, they are reassessed, quote unquote, every year based on their income. The tax rates don't go down to adjust for that, right? They just get reassessed at the new, they made 100,000 last year, they make 120,000 this year. They just get multiplied by the same percentage. You just pay more in income taxes. That's not what happens for cities. And this is one of the key reasons why property taxes are not a good tax base, and why sales taxes, business taxes, and personal income taxes are better tax bases, because they do actually adjust for changing circumstances. The other point, of course, is that property taxes don't necessarily reflect your ability to pay. And so, you're a retiree and your house went up, you live there 50 years in the beaches and your house value went up, whatever, 5,000%. You may not be able to pay higher income taxes. There are programs to offset that. But the income tax, sales tax, business taxes do proxy your ability to pay. So like if you make more, you pay more. If you make less, you pay less. They are just better tax systems than property taxes in general.
Thanks, David. It is a conundrum that, the property tax values have significantly increased in Toronto, but but at the same time, somebody's property tax, how much they pay can actually decrease. Another question from Adina Lebo. Other levels of government have said in the past, we don't see you using the tax powers you have. It's something we've heard from the province many times. Raise property taxes and entertainment, parking, licensing, etc. Use those first and don't come to us. We know that those taxes would bring in small amounts of money, not the big money which would come from taxes. So what do you think about them saying that again, going straight after the other federal and provincial money?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure some governments would say that. I don't doubt that that's what they would say. I mean, I think the point here is to, and cities are well aware of the case that property taxes is a bad tax base. It's a bad tax base for people. It's a bad tax base because it doesn't grow with GDP. These are better tax bases, and it provides. This is the benefit: is that provinces and municipalities can sort of sidestep requests from the cities for more money and avoid them kind of wearing tax increases and say, "Look, we just provided tools. Right? We're not increasing your taxes. The cities are, or maybe they're not. I don't know." So yeah, I mean, there's an argument for better and worse tax bases, and I think income taxes is one of the best tax bases that could legitimately be used by cities, and particularly if you've got access to some basic modifications or parameters within the tax system, like the tax table, which I was sort of pitching there. You could actually make you could make city revenues actually relatively progressive. If you wanted to. I mean, this is a choice, right? Cities could choose to make them regressive if they wanted to, hammer people making under 50 grand, right? If you wanted to. I don't think that's what cities would do, but it's an option, right? You'd have to, and you could kind of wear that. But yeah, I mean, this is the marketplace of ideas and the types of arguments that you would make. And you're exactly right. Those are counter arguments you would absolutely hear. Just raise property taxes instead. Stop messing around. And frankly, the city of Toronto has relatively low average property taxes compared to other cities, like half of what people pay in dollar values, in dollar terms, compared to other cities in the GTHA. Like Oakville, people pay twice as much, even once you adjust for higher property values there and the mill rate and so on. So, I mean, there is some truth to that. Not sure how much the city of Toronto is going to jack up property taxes by 30%, but in any event.
Thanks. Sheila from TTC Riders says, wishing we'd had this conversation earlier as City Council has given direction to Mayor Chow to negotiate for a new deal, including a municipal sales tax, but voted against specifically including income share tax. Do you have any thoughts on a municipal sales tax? And is it too late to put income tax on the agenda of the New Deal negotiations?
Well, I mean, you folks are quite concerned with Toronto and what's happening in Toronto. FCM, which is kind of more of a federal lobby body, they're much earlier in discussions around what revenue options they might want to ask for. And so there may have been directions sent to Mayor Chow through City of Toronto deliberations. That doesn't mean that those could change or that FCM couldn't advocate for something different. This is not it's not like this is a new issue. It's not, and it's also not an issue that's going away. And so I don't think, we've missed some critical deadline and this can never happen ever. I think there's lots of different opportunities. Having spoken directly with Mayor Chow about this while talking about revenue options at a table at FCM 2 months ago, she was very interested in this. And so, I don't think the timing in particular is so off that we should kind of kibosh the entire idea. In terms of sales taxes, I do think that there are certainly some benefits to sales taxes insofar as they do legitimately grow with economic growth over time. They aren't progressive. If you considered sales taxes without a low income transfer, so like the federal GST has a GST transfer that goes to low-income households to partially offset the fact that it's a regressive tax, right? You know, low-income people spend every dime that they make because they can't save, because there's no room to save, because housing's too expensive, food's too expensive, and so on. And so they pay, you know, sales tax on every dime that they make because they turn around and spend it. Wealthy people don't spend every dime that they make. You know, a lot of their money goes into savings, for which they're, you know, you're not paying, you know, PST on, you know, your stock market wins. And so a lot of that money goes into savings, and so they don't pay PST on every dime of money that they make. Low income people definitely do, and so it ends up being a regressive tax. Part of that's offset by a GST transfer. There's also a you know, provincial version of that. If you were to have a municipal sales tax, you would probably want some sort of version of that. And again, you know, this is where it's not maybe as straightforward. The PST thing, if you wanted to do it right, is not as straightforward as you might think, because now you've got to think of a transfer that you might want to implement. It's also easier to avoid, right? Like drive down the 401, you know, go to you know, Mississauga or whatever and buy your you know, big purchase in Mississauga. People will absolutely do that. I don't know if they'll do it on smaller purchases, but they'll do it on big purchases for sure. You know, they'll try to avoid that PST. And so it is avoidable. You know, our business is going to locate outside of Toronto to avoid it. I don't know. You know, I think that if in the long game, access to personal income taxes should be the goal. I'm not sure if PST increases are more likely politically in the short term. I frankly don't think that they are. I don't think there's any interest at the provincial level of approving this. And so, you know, if you're just going to get a straight up no from the province anyway, like, might as well advocate for the better option. But, you know, there's certainly more precedent for cities charging sales taxes in a variety of senses, broadly, or even on, you know, hotels, for instance, than there is for income taxes, you know, in North America. So if you look at other cities that have more powers, often one of those powers is PST. And so there's more precedent. I don't think that means that it's better. I just think that it was probably easier. And it may have been easier in a, you know, in a technical sense. I don't think that's true anymore. I think that, you know, we kind of need to update our models to the fact that, like, we live in the computer age. You know, no one does this stuff on paper. CRA doesn't do this on paper. It's all done by computers. It would be much easier to implement this sort of thing today than it would have been 20 years ago. Whereas a sales tax is, frankly, potentially easier to implement 20 years ago. It's also potentially, you know, I don't know if it's frankly any easier to implement today, but it certainly would have been 20 years ago. And that may be why the precedent was set, not because it's better, it's just because it was easier.
That's a great perspective on the income, why we tend to see more sales tax. Just to give Sheila a bit of a plug, she did share TTC Riders has been doing some exploration of and advocacy around the commercial parking tax levy, and so she chaired an event in the chat, so please feel free to pass that on. Doug also asked a question about the implementation of the income tax. He asks if it's possible to constitutionalize municipal access to the tax table through a single province amendment to ensure access couldn't be rescinded by a future federal or provincial government.
I'm not sure changing the Constitution is something that's conceivable, given previous approaches in the 1980s. I think it's extraordinarily unlikely that you would want to do that. Yeah, is it possible? Sure, it's possible, but I just think that it's probably not worth it. You know, you may open yourself up to other changes that you might not like in the Constitution. But yeah, I mean, it's possible. I think that it's probably easier just to do it with agreements between the feds and the provinces.
Beth, you have your hand up?
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to ask David about the Tobin tax, and as a small tax on financial transactions. When you were presenting on corporate income taxes, and that there were certain problems with being able to get revenue from corporate income taxes, I was thinking, are there alternatives that would help fund cities from, you know, corporate profit. So the Tobin tax came to mind, but I wonder if there are other ways as well.
It's the same problem. So you have to localize, right? Like where is the income? That's the problem. For corporate income taxes, so you have to like locate that income. Where is that income generated? Or in the case of corporate side, profit, where's the profit generated? Who generated that profit? And then you take the profit, you multiply it by the tax rate, and that's how much taxes you owe, right? To that level of government. So the way it works for corporate income taxes provincially is that it's a formula. It's where you employ people and where your sales happen. And so where you employ people, so if you employ a whole bunch of people in the Yukon, but all your sales are in Ontario, half of your profits are allocated to the Yukon government via their corporate income tax system, half of your profits are allocated to Ontario, and you pay their corporate income taxes. You can't just say, oh, actually, we'd like to declare all of our profits in Nunavut because the tax rate's lower. CRA will say, no, that's not how it works. Internationally, that is how it works. You can say, oh, it turns out all of the profits from Starbucks were actually in our Bahamas subsidiary that owns all of our trademarks and overcharges all of our stores across the country. So our profits in Canada are zero. Our profits in Barbados are whatever, $50 billion. And it just so happens the tax rate in Barbados is zero. So we pay no taxes. Thank you very much. The issue with, so there is a system in Canada already where at least if you're employing people and you have sales in Canada, you can't mess around that much. Like it is a decent form. It's not, maybe not, you might argue it's not a good formula, but there is a formula. Internationally, there is no formula yet. I mean, there is work towards it in the BEPS process in the OECD, but there is no process for it yet. Localizing that income may be on the same type of formula. Municipally, there isn't that doesn't exist, right? And so you've got the problem of creating that system. I think that it would be relatively difficult to do that. The Tobin tax, which is insofar as people transact, Tobin tax traditionally was thought it was on currencies. So if you're trading currencies, you pay an extra very small amount on changing your Canadian dollars to US dollars or whatever. The big value in that is big players. So in the case of Toronto, actually, because of Bay Street, you probably actually would make more money, frankly, if you could localize Tobin taxes to because there are no big currency trading firms in Windsor. And so Windsor would see nothing from this tax, right? Even if you could kind of localize it. But the problem, of course, is that it's all electronic and so on. So maybe currency trading firms move to Windsor because they don't have a Tobin tax in Windsor. And so, yeah, I think it's close to impossible for corporate income taxes, and it'd be basically entirely impossible on Tobin taxes because of the allocation problem that hasn't been dealt with. And we don't have, and moreover, we don't even have a Tobin tax system. We actually have a corporate income tax system. We do not have a Tobin tax system. And so that makes it even harder to sort of create and then implement and then make it only for cities. I just think that it's just too complicated, unfortunately.
Thanks, David. I'm going to throw it out to the audience, but before I do that, there was a great question from Jay in the chat as well. He says, people who live on the street often feed themselves with taxable food items. So how can we set a fairer system that doesn't mean so much of their panhandling goes to enrich governments that don't look after their needs?
Yeah, I mean, this is the difference between personal income taxes and sales taxes, right? A lot of people who pay sales taxes don't even pay personal income taxes because they already get enough deductions in the personal income tax system to not pay income taxes at all. There's about 25% of tax filers file their taxes but don't pay income tax. They already have enough deductions in the personal income tax system to not pay. That's certainly going to cover somebody who's panhandling, who has no income or no declared income or very little declared income. That's the difference, right? Sales tax charges them. Sales tax charges them. That's why it's regressive, is because folks at the low end of the system who may pay nothing in the personal income tax system or pay at the lower rate absolutely pay in progressive income tax system, in sales tax system. Again, you could offset this through a tax credit like the GST credit that, people like, it's certainly an issue to get people who are living on the streets or, don't have a fixed address to file income taxes. It's actually a challenge, and therefore get access to things like the GST credit, but at least it exists. If you were to implement a municipal sales tax, you would potentially want some sort of offset, but then that becomes complicated because it's plausible that a municipal sales tax system is not run through existing systems like the HST. And if it's run totally separately, you don't have access to those tools to potentially even transfer an offset to people who have no income, who are panhandling, don't have an address, whatever. So yeah, that's one of the big differences: sales taxes versus income taxes.
Thanks, David. I have one last question that I'm going to throw to you, but throw it to the audience as well. What do you see as the role of civil society in advocating for increased funding to municipalities? Because surely all of this, whatever tools, we need the permission of the federal and provincial government, whether it be through income tax, sales tax, or whatever. So what do you think? And if others have ideas, please share it in the chat or put your hand up. I'd love to hear.
Yeah, I think in this case, this is a strategy. It's a potential approach that could lead to higher revenues. It is true to say that, look, the city of Toronto could just raise property taxes 30% and it'd still be cheaper than, a lot of the GTHA. And they're not willing to do that. Governments will always complain that some other level of government should give them more money. The provinces have all these tools, but they will the provinces have all these tools. Ontario has all these tools, and they're running a surplus. And they're still saying, federal government, you don't pay enough for healthcare. Well, the province could just fix it itself if it wanted to. So I don't think that there's a monopoly on complaining other levels of government aren't giving you enough money. And cities, are no exception to that. Cities do have tools that exist. I think that there are potentially better tools, and this is a way to strategically advocate for those. But, again, cities may not even use them, right? This is the problem, right? Like maybe cities wouldn't even use these. That's certainly an option, and certainly within the bounds here is that cities would say, no, we don't want to use this. We're happy with providing poorer services so that people can pay lower taxes. Like this is an actual political argument, right? People want to drive their cars from their house in the suburbs to their house to, their work downtown, and they don't want to pay higher taxes. They don't use the pools. They don't care about childcare. They don't care about transit because they drive their cars. They do not want more services. They don't want those services to be better. They just want lower taxes. There's a group of people that will always be that way. We need to recognize that. But revenue is a critical way that we can provide better services for the people. Most people do want better services, and will locate in cities with better services because taxes aren't everything. And in most cases, they're nothing. Most people don't consider taxes at all when they decide where they're going to live. They try to figure out, is it a good neighborhood? Do my kids go to a good school? Can I get a good job? Am I close to my job? Do I have to commute for 5 hours to work every day? Those utterly overwhelm any difference in, $1,000 in property taxes in a year. So yeah, anyway, I'll leave it there. This is an approach to potentially getting better services. It is not better services. It doesn't relieve us from advocating for better services, but it might make it easier. It's plausible it might make it easier, and it's strategic for sure.
Thank you so much, David. I think this has been an incredible, somewhat hopeful discussion in this field of city budgets, which have been pretty disheartening for the past few years. It's exciting to see that there's some ideas that may have some traction in the next little while. So happy to support it and keep in touch. I'm going to, before we wrap up, a big thank you to you, David. I'm going to just share my screen again so that we can and give a last plug to SBT's budget workshops. Once again, we're having our first budget workshop on November 14th from 6:30 to 8 p.m. And that's Migrant Rights Network is joining us, as well as Acorn, to talk about tax myths and facts, and we're going to talk a little bit about the progressive versus regressive taxes and what it means for low-income communities. Also on November 28th, we're going to be talking about funding an equitable city. And so Beth is going to help us dive deeper and to get a better understanding of the city's budget process, how it works. So for anybody you know who's new to the budget process, wants to get to know it a little bit better, and meet other people who are also interested in this, please share these resources. The links are in the chat and will be shared. And then once again, the city is having its budget consultations. Just as David said, there are those people who, you know, the most important thing to them is keeping property taxes lower. And so, you know, this is an opportunity for you to share what's most important. What do you feel needs to be prioritized in the city's budget? I'd hate to see that we have cuts coming down the line, but that is what we're hearing. So we need to make sure City Council knows exactly what's important to us and to our communities. So thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you, Beth, for setting us up for this conversation. If you haven't already, please join the subscribe to SPT's Budget Watch blog. We'll share more updates about events and meetings coming up and more intel on the city budget process.